You think you know the Vikings. But what if I told you? History lied to you about the women. For centuries, the Viking woman was painted as a background figure, barefoot, apron-bound, tending to children, and waiting for the warriors to return. A domestic soul in a brutal age of conquest. But that image was never the full truth. There's a reason the sagas speak in riddles, and the myths whisper through bloodlines. Because behind every sword raised in the Viking Age, there may have been a woman just as fierce. And yet, history buried them. Literally and figuratively. Until now. In this first chapter, we tear apart the myths that have distorted Viking womanhood for generations. Let's begin at the root of the deception. Early scholars, mostly men of the Victorian and Enlightenment periods, viewed Viking society through their own patriarchal lenses. To them, it made sense to assume that only men fought, ruled, and made history. Women were rarely mentioned in historical records, and when they were, it was often in passing or with suspicion. So they built an image of Viking women as passive homemakers, nurturers, quiet souls kept far from blade or blood. But they ignored the stories, the graves, the weapons, the sagas. They ignored the clues right beneath their feet. In Norse mythology, women weren't weak. They were Valkyries. They were Shieldmaidens. They were queens, witches, and seers. They were life-givers and life-takers. These stories weren't metaphors. They were reflections of a real-world society that allowed women far more power and presence than later European cultures dared to imagine. And yet, those same later cultures buried the truth, because it didn't fit the narrative they wanted to tell. It's only in the past few decades that archaeologists and historians have started correcting the record. New techniques, DNA testing, bone structure analysis, isotope scanning, have revealed that some of the Viking male warrior graves from past centuries weren't male at all. They were women. Women buried with swords, axes, shields. With war horses. With command insignias. With honor. One of the most striking examples is the Birka warrior grave in Sweden. For over a century, it was assumed to be the grave of a powerful male Viking warrior, buried with a full set of weapons, 2 horses, and a game board believed to represent strategy and leadership. But in 2017, researchers revealed something astonishing. The skeleton was genetically female. This wasn't a fluke. It was a rewriting of everything we thought we knew. So why did it take so long to admit it? Because the myth of male-only warrior culture was easier. It was cleaner. And maybe less threatening. Accepting that women fought, led, and commanded challenged more than Viking history. It challenged centuries of academic bias. For those in power, the truth was uncomfortable. But truth, like the rising tide, cannot be held back forever. Today we're seeing more and more graves re-examined. More stories unearthed. More women rising from beneath the soil, weapons still in hand, demanding to be seen. These discoveries are forcing us to ask, what else have we missed? What other truths were buried because they didn't fit the narrative? Because Viking women were never just wives and mothers. They were warriors, artisans, traders, and rulers. They trained, they led, they fought, and they won. Even in the medieval sagas, those haunting epic tales passed down for centuries, women are not mere ornaments. They are fierce. Take Lagertha, a legendary warrior said to have fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok. Or Hervir, a woman who disguised herself as a man to retrieve her father's magical sword. These aren't just fantasy. They echo the real possibilities of history. They reflect values that Norse society respected: courage, cunning, and strength, regardless of gender. So why do we still picture Viking men storming into battle while women knit by the hearth? Because history is shaped by those who write it. And for centuries the pen and the power belonged to men. But history is evolving. New voices are rising. And in the echoes of long-forgotten graves, the truth speaks. The truth that Viking women were never background characters. They were the storm. They were the sea. They were the sword and the song. So forget the apron-bound peasant. Meet the woman who wore chainmail beneath it. The story begins now. The Viking world, a society beyond the sword. To understand the women of the Viking Age, we must first understand their world. Not just the long ships and battle cries, but the daily rhythms of life. The hum of industry. The quiet authority behind closed doors. The whisper of power in unexpected places. Forget what you think you know about Viking life. Because Viking society was far more complex, diverse, and progressive, yes, progressive, than most of us were ever taught. The Viking world spanned from Scandinavia to the edges of Byzantium. From the icy fjords of Norway to the steppes of Russia, Viking traders, settlers, and explorers brought their customs with them. And those customs included a surprising amount of gender flexibility, especially compared to their European contemporaries. The home was not simply a woman's domain, it was her fortress. In the absence of men, Viking women ran households, managed farms, negotiated with merchants, and even led entire communities. They were entrusted with land, property, and legal authority. That's right, Viking women could own land. They could inherit property. They could divorce their husbands. They had legal voices in assemblies called the Thing, and could demand justice for wrongs committed against them. This was not a culture of submission. This was a society of participation. Inside the Longhouse, women weren't just caretakers. They were powerful economic agents. They spun wool, wove fabric, brewed ale, tanned hides, forged jewelry, and oversaw the preparation of food and supplies that sustained Viking expeditions. They made and managed wealth, sometimes more so than their male counterparts. Take the Oseberg ship burial, one of the most lavish Viking tombs ever discovered. Buried within were two women, surrounded by luxury, sledges, tapestries, ornate wooden carvings, imported silks from the east, and even sacrificed animals. This wasn't a grave of servants. It was a royal burial. Some scholars believe one of these women was a high priestess or queen, perhaps even a seeress, one who spoke with the gods. It's evidence like this that challenges the old belief that Viking women only existed in shadows. Because clearly some of them walked in the light, at the very center of society. And in religion, their influence only grows. Viking spirituality revolved around gods and goddesses, Odin and Thor, yes, but also Freya, Frigg, Hel, and Skadi. Freya wasn't just a fertility goddess. She was a war deity. She chose half the slain from battle to live in her hall, just as Odin claimed the other half for Valhalla. She rode a chariot drawn by cats. She commanded magic. She wept tears of gold. She wasn't just beautiful, she was terrifying. Viking women participated in ritual. They practiced cedar, an ancient form of Norse magic. Seeresses known as Valvas traveled from village to village, offering prophecy, protection, and spiritual counsel. These women were feared and respected. Their staffs, often buried with them, were symbols of power. Their clothing distinct. Their voices heard. Even in politics, women had a presence. Powerful queens and noble women influenced succession, arranged alliances, and governed territories. Some even ruled in their own right. Like Queen Asa of Norway, whose grave included a warship. Or Gunhild, mother of kings, a political strategist and rumored sorceress. Their names echo through the sagas, not as footnotes but as forces. The Viking world wasn't perfect. Women still faced risks. War, childbirth, disease. There were patriarchal structures. But compared to feudal England or medieval France, the freedoms Viking women enjoyed were remarkable. They lived in a society where strength was respected, no matter who wielded it. And that strength wasn't always physical. It was found in the loom, the field, the runestone, the law court. It was found in women who held families, clans, and kingdoms together while their men sailed into the unknown. So the next time you picture the Viking world, remember, it wasn't just forged by the sword. It was woven by the hands of women. With thread, with wisdom, and with fire. Warriors in the shadows, women who fought. When we imagine Viking warriors, we think of towering men, bearded, battle-worn, swinging axes on windswept shores. But history and archaeology tell a more nuanced story, because among those warriors were women. For centuries, the idea of female Viking fighters was dismissed as fantasy, dismissed as saga fiction or modern wishful thinking. But recent discoveries have rewritten the record. And the truth is, Viking women were not only mythic warriors, they were real. Take the Birka warrior. In 1878, a richly furnished grave was unearthed on the Swedish island of Birka. Inside was a skeleton, surrounded by weapons: sword, axe, spear, arrows, as well as 2 horses and a gaming board. Clearly a warrior of high rank. For over a century it was assumed to be a man. Until 2017. When DNA analysis revealed the warrior was, in fact, biologically female. This single discovery shattered long-standing assumptions about gender roles in Viking warfare. It confirmed what sagas and stories had hinted for generations: that some Viking women picked up arms, that some trained, fought, and commanded troops. But the Birka warrior is not alone. Across the Viking world, archaeologists have uncovered other graves containing female remains buried with weapons. Some with shields and blades, others with battle scars. In Norway, in Denmark, in England. Each one adds another thread to the tapestry of Viking warrior women. The sagas, the Icelandic stories passed down for generations, speak of these women often. There's Lager, the Shieldmaiden of legend, who fought beside Ragnar Lothbrok. There's Freydis Eriksdottir, sister of Leif Erikson, who took up a sword to defend her camp in Vinland. Some call them myth. Others call them inspiration drawn from truth. Were all Viking women warriors? No, but some were. And those few carved their names into history, not with pens but with blades. Modern historians continue to debate the extent of female participation in Viking combat. But even the skeptics agree. Women had more military agency in Viking society than almost any other medieval culture. They defended homesteads, led raiding parties, trained their sons in swordplay, and when needed, they fought. But what drove these women to war? Honor, vengeance, duty, perhaps even glory. In a world shaped by violence, survival sometimes demanded the strength of a shield maiden. So when we speak of Viking warriors, let's not only remember the loudest voices or the tallest statues. Let's remember those who bled in silence, who fought and fell and were buried in armor. Not just warriors, but legends. Power, politics, and the queens of the north. Not all power in the Viking world came from the battlefield. Some of it was forged in the chambers of politics, in alliances sealed by marriage, in quiet words whispered across long tables lit by fire. And some of the most powerful figures in these games of thrones were women. Viking queens and noble women were not ornamental. They were influential. They brokered peace. They waged diplomatic war. They were landowners, leaders, and sometimes the beating heart of Viking courts. One such woman was Queen Asa of Norway, a matriarch remembered in saga and song. According to legend, she ruled alongside her husband King Gudrod, but when he was assassinated, Asa took control of the realm. She ruled as queen regent, raised her son to be king, and oversaw one of the most elaborate burials ever found, the Oseberg ship. She wasn't just remembered, she was revered. Then there was Gunhild, mother of kings. A brilliant strategist, her name appears in multiple sagas. Some paint her as a witch, others as a cunning diplomat. Perhaps she was both. She was married to King Eirik Bloodaxe, but her influence stretched far beyond the throne. She maneuvered her sons into power, orchestrated alliances, and protected her family's legacy through sheer intellect and will. And in the Icelandic sagas, we meet Eudi the deep-minded, a woman who defied expectations. After her husband and son died, she built a ship in secret, gathered her kin, and led them across the sea to Iceland. There, she claimed land as a chieftain, distributed property, and founded a powerful lineage. Eudi was not just a settler. She was a sovereign. These women weren't exceptions. They were examples. Their power didn't come from brute force. It came from intellect, lineage, and legacy. Marriage in Viking society wasn't always a cage. It was often a contract. Women brought dowries, negotiated terms, and retained rights to their own property. Some even initiated divorce. Unlike in much of medieval Europe, Viking women had leverage. Noble women commanded households with dozens of servants. They managed estates, collected taxes, and represented their families at the Thing. Their words carried weight. Their signatures shaped history. In the warrior world of the North, queens wore no crowns. But they wore authority, sometimes in the form of fur-lined cloaks, sometimes in the whisper of their name at court, and sometimes in the silent obedience of kings. Swordplay and sisterhood, training the Shieldmaidens. To fight is to be prepared. And for the Viking women who took up arms, training wasn't an act of rebellion, it was tradition. Long before the clashing of swords and the roar of battle horns, there were quiet fields, forest clearings, and hidden courtyards where women trained side by side with men. We don't know how many Viking women trained for battle, but we know they existed. And we know the stories of shield maidens, defenders, and vengeful daughters were not only legends, they were echoes of lived lives. The Icelandic sagas speak of Brynhildr, a warrior so skilled she was considered unbeatable, and Hervair, who donned armor and rode to reclaim her father's cursed sword, Turfing. They weren't just stories, they were cultural memory. Young girls in farming villages may have watched their brothers train and learned alongside them. In some households, a sword was passed down not to the son, but to the most capable heir. Fathers, proud of their daughters, taught them to shoot, to ride, and to defend their homes. Because in Viking lands, raids didn't wait for men to be home. Weapon training began early. Wooden swords, straw dummies, archery in open fields. Strength was cultivated, but so was agility. Combat was as much about movement and awareness as it was about power. Some women disguised themselves to join raiding parties. Others stood guard at ports, sounding alarms and holding the line. And in times of crisis, when war reached the village gates, they took up weapons without hesitation. There were no barracks. There were no uniforms. But there was preparation. And there was pride. Imagine a young woman kneeling beside her mother, learning to stitch wounds as well as wield knives. Imagine sisters learning hand-to-hand combat from older siblings. This wasn't rebellion. This was survival. When the shield maidens entered battle, they did so not as novelties, but as warriors. Their training may not have been formalized, but their courage was forged. Today, historians debate how organized these women warriors were. But Viking poems and chronicles speak of women who led charges, planned ambushes, and rallied clans. They didn't always wear helmets, but they wore resolve. In modern reconstructions, women in Viking reenactment groups rediscover the strength of these ancestors. They feel the weight of the shield, the balance of the sword, and the pride in standing where history once erased them. Shield maidens were not fantasies. They were fighters, sisters, leaders, and their training began not with glory, but with grit. Legacy of blood and honor, the afterlife of Viking women. When Viking women died, their stories didn't end. They were woven into legend, carved in stone, buried with honor, and remembered in ways both sacred and strange. Death was not defeat in Norse culture. It was transformation. And for many Viking women, especially those who lived powerfully, died bravely, or served honorably, their deaths were ceremonies of status and strength. The Viking afterlife was not a singular place. There was Valhalla, the famed Hall of the Slain, where warriors chosen by Odin feasted forever. But there was also Folkvangr, ruled by the goddess Freya, where half of the battle dead were taken. Some believe that's where the shield maidens went. Freya herself was no passive goddess. She rode a chariot pulled by cats, commanded battle maidens, and was revered for beauty and wrath. She was the goddess of love, fertility, and war. And for Viking women who fought, healed, or led, they might have hoped for her fields of peace and glory. But how were these women remembered in this life? With grandeur, with purpose, and sometimes with mystery. Burials weren't just resting places, they were messages. In Oseberg, 2 women were buried in a ship of staggering craftsmanship. One may have been Queen Asa. Their grave held rich tapestries, a sleigh, animals, intricately carved animal headposts, and ceremonial items suggesting high rank. Even today, no one knows exactly who they were, but we know they mattered. The detail of their grave goods tells us they were leaders, visionaries, and possibly priestesses or queens. Other female graves include swords, shields, tools, and game boards. These weren't buried with children or ceremonial dolls. These were markers of leadership, of intellect, of experience, and sometimes weapons. In the famous Birka burial in Sweden, Archaeologists long believed they had found a great male warrior laid to rest with armor, horses, and a full weapons set. But DNA testing told a different story. The warrior was a woman. A female Viking warrior with a battle-ready grave fit for a general. This revelation rewrote textbooks. It proved that even in death, Viking women could command respect, and armies. It challenged assumptions, sparked debates, and opened a doorway into re-evaluating dozens of similar graves across Scandinavia. And their stories didn't end in tombs. The sagas carried their names. The poets recited their glories. The songs sang of Hervor, of Lagertha, of Yunen. Some sagas even described women turning into spirits of vengeance, ghostly protectors or restless warriors roaming the night to defend their kin. They believed the dead could walk. They believed their ancestors lived on through blood, through ritual, and through remembrance. The Viking idea of death was not darkness. It was continuation. It was passage. If a woman had honor, if she upheld family, fought for justice, led with courage, then her death was merely her next chapter. Her spirit may guard the hearth, her memory invoked in ceremonies. Even today their legacy remains. In modern media, in reenactments, in the stories being retold by scholars, historians, writers, and artists, the bones of Viking women still speak. Through swords, through shields, through soil. Through the preserved remnants of ship burials, funerary jewelry, and runestones that have weathered centuries of storms. We see them now not as shadows behind great men, but as legends in their own right. As rulers of hearth and battlefield. As symbols of duality, nurture and war, wisdom and wrath. And when we look at the ancient burial mounds, the tapestries, the runestones, we remember. They lived with pride. They died with fire. And they passed into a legacy that still burns. They are not forgotten. They never were. Shattered myths, the truth behind the Shieldmaiden. The image of the Viking woman warrior, hair braided, sword raised, charging into battle, is one of the most dramatic in all of history. But was it real? Or just legend? For years, historians dismissed the idea. They argued that sagas were fiction, dramatized tales passed down through oral tradition. They claimed the real Viking woman was a homemaker, strong yes but not a warrior. They pointed to a lack of written records. They cited the gender norms of medieval Europe. They doubted that women could have held weapons, let alone led men into battle. But then the grave started speaking. The Birka warrior wasn't alone. Across Scandinavia, dozens of burial sites revealed women interred with weapons, armor, and horses, symbols traditionally associated with male warriors. Some graves held battle axes beside weaving looms, swords wrapped in fine linen, shields placed lovingly atop female remains. Suddenly, scholars had to rethink everything. These were not token burials. They were ceremonial, deliberate. If these women were not warriors, why bury them like generals? The sagas, once dismissed as myth, now seemed eerily prescient. In the saga of Hervor, a young woman dons armor, reclaims her father's cursed sword, and leads armies. In Saxo Grammaticus's chronicles, Lagertha, the legendary warrior wife of Ragnar Lothbrok, commands legions. Are these stories entirely factual? Perhaps not. But are they based on archetypes that were real? Absolutely. Still, debate continues. Some claim the weapon burials were symbolic, that these women were buried with swords as spiritual objects, not tools of war. Others argue that Vikings had flexible gender roles. That in a society where survival demanded strength, women had the opportunity, if not the expectation, to defend hearth and home. Archaeological finds now confirm this. DNA evidence, isotope analysis, skeletal injuries consistent with combat. These aren't metaphors, they're facts. One example, the Kopang burial site. Here, a woman was laid to rest with a full weapons kit, horse bones, and riding gear. Her hip bones clearly identified her as female. She had lived well, fought hard. Another, the Repton excavation in England. Among Viking warriors buried during the Great Heathen Army's invasion, several female skeletons have been identified, armed and armored. In 2019, new technology allowed scientists to analyze muscle attachment on skeletons. They found female remains with developed shoulders and arms, consistent with years of sword training. These were not fragile court ladies. These were shield maidens. Still, some questions remain. Were female warriors the norm? Likely not. Were they respected? Feared? In some cases, yes. Especially in a society that revered strength and loyalty over rigid gender divisions. The truth is likely somewhere in between legend and law. Not every Viking woman fought, but some did. And they weren't pretending. They were trained. They were respected. They were real. Today, artists and historians revisit the Shield Maidens story with fresh eyes. Museums recreate their graves. Novels are written in their voices. Films depict them not as background characters, but as central figures in the Viking Age. Because these women were not anomalies. They were answers to a question we didn't know we should ask. What if history forgot them? Not because they weren't there, but because no one wanted to see. Now we see. And the image of the Viking woman with a blade in her hand? It's no longer just myth. It's memory. It's evidence. It's truth. Sacred and strange rituals of the Viking women. Beyond battlefields and burial ships, there were other powers Viking women wielded, powers of the unseen, the sacred, and the feared. In the world of the Norse, spiritual power was as vital as brute strength. And in this realm, women often ruled. Viking society respected those who could read omens, speak to the gods, and guide the living through death. And many of those roles were held by women. They were called Volvas, seeresses, prophetesses, priestesses of fate. A Volva did not live like other women. She often traveled alone or with servants, feared and respected wherever she went. Clothed in heavy wool cloaks, adorned with beads, brooches, and staffs carved with runes, she carried knowledge older than kings. Volvas performed Seder, a form of Norse magic involving trance, chanting, and spiritual journeys. They summoned spirits. They interpreted dreams. They cast spells of protection or destruction. One of the most famous tales of a Volva appears in the saga of Eric the Red. When a settlement faced famine, the villagers summoned a Volva named Thorbjorg. She wore a blue cloak, catskin gloves, and a staff inlaid with brass. She was served a special porridge made from animal hearts. She sat in a high seat, sang ritual songs, and communed with the spirit world. Her words gave hope and direction. Volvas were not witches in the Christian sense. They were respected conduits between the human and the divine. They honored Odin, Freya, and the Norns, the spinners of fate. But make no mistake, they were feared too. Men bowed before them. Warriors hesitated to cross them. They were the living boundary between the known and unknown. Aside from magic, Viking women also led important rituals of life and death. They oversaw births, funerals, seasonal festivals, and harvest blessings. Their songs and chants were believed to bind the tribe together. Their ceremonies ensured safe voyages, good weather, and protection in battle. Some women prepared the dead for burial, washing the body, dressing it, and wrapping it in cloth. They decided which goods accompanied the deceased, tools, jewelry, even weapons. They knew how to speak to the gods. They knew what the dead needed for the afterlife. In some high-status funerals, female slaves were sacrificed to accompany their mistresses to the next world. It was brutal, but also seen as sacred duty. The ceremony was conducted with religious precision, involving incense, chants, and feasts. Even childbirth was a spiritual event. Midwives and elder women used herbal knowledge, protective charms, and ritual prayers to ensure survival. In a world where childbirth was deadly, women who guided others through it were venerated. What we see through these rituals is a culture that didn't limit women to passive roles. It gave them domains of power, life, death, the divine. It made their voices necessary, their wisdom irreplaceable, and their legacy didn't vanish. The concept of the Volva echoes through Norse mythology, runic inscriptions, and modern reinterpretations of Viking spirituality. Today, some practitioners of Norse paganism still invoke the Volva's name, still seek the old rites. Because even in the age of kings and warlords, Viking women shaped reality, not just with sword or needle, but with spell and song. Echoes through time, the legacy of Viking women warriors. The Viking Age officially ended in the 11th century, but its stories never died. They sailed across time, whispering from old sagas, etched in runestones, buried beneath fields and fjords. And within these stories, so often dominated by kings and conquerors, echo the footsteps of women who walked beside them. Today, the legacy of Viking women warriors is being reclaimed, reinterpreted, and reimagined. Historians, artists, and archaeologists are uncovering truths long hidden beneath the dust of male-centered history. Modern technology has played a role. DNA testing, isotope analysis, and forensic anthropology have helped reclassify dozens of Viking graves once assumed to hold men. They don't. Some belong to women buried with honor, with weapons, and with power. In Sweden, the Birka warrior continues to challenge academic orthodoxy. Once thought to be male, now confirmed female, she remains one of the most iconic symbols of Viking-era gender complexity. Her grave wasn't an accident. It was a message. Museums around the world now curate exhibits on Viking women, not just as weavers and wives, but as explorers, sorceresses, merchants, leaders, and yes, warriors. Their likenesses stand in armor. Their tools are displayed with reverence. Their stories are finally being told. Pop culture has followed. TV shows, graphic novels, video games, they've brought Shieldmaidens to the screen in glorious, gritty detail. Some dramatized, some romanticized, but all inspired by the same undeniable truth. These women existed. Viking reenactment groups across Europe and North America include female warriors in their ranks, based not on fantasy but on research. They train with axes and shields. They study burial rites. They bring history to life with honor. But the legacy isn't just in museums or media. It lives in spirit. In young girls who discover a forgotten lineage of strength. In women who learn that courage isn't confined to one era. In a culture that remembers that power wears many faces. For centuries, the narrative of Viking life was shaped by conquest and colonization. Men raised the sails. Men carved the runes. Men told the tales. Or so we thought. Now we see a fuller picture. A more honest one. Yes, Viking men were fierce. But so were Viking women. They didn't need to carry swords to be powerful. But some did. And they weren't imitating men. They were answering their own call. In Old Norse mythology, fate was spun by the Norns, 3 women who decided the destinies of all. The Vikings understood that behind every empire is a thread pulled by unseen hands. And often those hands belong to women. So when you think of Vikings, don't just think of raiders and kings. Think of the women who buried them, who raised their children, who blessed their ships, who held the line, and, on rare but unforgettable days, picked up their blades and charged into legend. This is their story. This is their echo. And it still rings. Love, marriage, and relationships in Viking society. When you picture the Viking world, you might imagine roaring raids, fierce warriors, or longships slicing through the sea. But what about love? What about partnership? In the Viking Age, relationships weren't just personal, they were deeply political, spiritual, and practical. Love in Norse culture wasn't always about passion. It was often about power. Marriage served as a bond between families, a tool to secure land, allegiance, or status. And Viking women? They weren't passive participants. They had a voice and rights. Unlike many other medieval societies, Viking women could choose to marry, or not. They could divorce their husbands. They could keep the property they brought into the marriage. And if mistreated, they had recourse through law. A marriage was a contract, a solemn agreement between families, witnessed, celebrated, and sacred. Wedding ceremonies were rich with ritual. Swords were exchanged as a symbol of trust. A ceremonial bed was blessed by family elders. Feasts lasted days. And while arranged marriages were common, love matches existed too. Poetry reveals the depth of emotion in Viking hearts. Skaldic verses often speak of longing, heartbreak, and forbidden affection. And the sagas? They're filled with tales of lovers who defied kings and fate itself. Take the story of Gudrun and Sigurd, a saga steeped in betrayal and passion. Their tragic love burned through generations. Or Freydis, daughter of Eric the Red, whose fierce independence made her both admired and feared, even in love. Infidelity was frowned upon, but not always punished equally. Men could take concubines, but wives could protest. And some women held enough power to make such arrangements themselves. In wealthier households, Viking couples often shared leadership. A wife managed the home, the livestock, the food, and the finances. Her keys were a symbol of authority and responsibility. If a husband died, the wife became head of the household. She could inherit land, remarry, or rule in her own name. The sagas tell of women who sued in court, led voyages, and commanded trade, sometimes even after becoming widows. Sexuality in Viking society was complex. While masculine dominance was often idealized, the culture acknowledged variation. Female warriors, unmarried women, widows, they each held different freedoms. What mattered most was reputation. Honor could be gained or lost in how a relationship was handled. Cheating, abandonment, or cruelty could lead to legal punishment, or even blood feuds. Romance was not just personal, it was mythic. Goddesses like Freya ruled over love, fertility, and beauty. She wept tears of gold for her lost lover Od. In Norse myth, even the gods were caught in tangled romances, filled with longing, deception, and sacrifice. Viking women's roles and relationships were neither submissive nor secondary. They shaped alliances, defended honor, and navigated courtship with strategy and spirit. So when we think of Viking romance, don't imagine only wild passions or arranged unions. Imagine powerful partnerships, shared leadership, emotional resilience. Imagine love as something sacred, strategic, and, at times, tragic. Because even in the age of swords and stormy seas, Viking hearts beat with fire. Famous Viking women from sagas and history. History is often written by the victors. And too often those victors were men. But buried in the sagas, inscribed in runes, and whispered through time are the names of Viking women who defied expectations, challenged power, and forged their own paths. These are their stories. Let us begin with Lagertha, perhaps the most famous Viking shield maiden. According to the legendary saga by Saxo Grammaticus, she fought alongside Ragnar Lothbrok, saving his life more than once in battle. Fierce, loyal, and cunning, she later ruled as a queen in her own right. Some historians debate her existence, but whether fact or folklore, her legacy ignites imaginations to this day. Then there's Freydis Eriksdottir, the daughter of Eric the Red. When Vikings journeyed to Vinland, believed to be part of modern-day North America, Freydis sailed with them. During a brutal attack by native forces, she stood pregnant, wielding a sword, scaring enemies into retreat. Strong-willed and ruthless, her story is controversial, but undeniably fearless. Gudi the Deep-Minded was another trailblazer. A noblewoman and explorer, she led her family from Norway to the newly discovered Iceland after her husband's death. She claimed land, built a settlement, and distributed property, an unheard-of feat for a woman at the time. She's still honored in Icelandic history as one of its founding figures. Another powerful name from the sagas is Gunhild, Mother of Kings. Wife of King Eric Bloodaxe, she was said to be a sorceress and a political mastermind. Feared for her cunning and strength, she influenced dynastic affairs and royal decisions in both Norway and England. And then we have Queen Asa of Hedeby. A real historical figure, Asa ruled one of the most powerful Viking trade cities. Her grave, lavishly adorned, revealed her status and authority. She likely played a critical role in political alliances and regional economics. The sagas also speak of Brynhildr, a Valkyrie-turned-mortal woman whose tragic love triangle with Sigurd and Gudrun fueled legends across generations. Part myth, part memory, her story reveals the intersection of divine femininity and earthly fate in Norse lore. Viking history is filled with women who weren't merely survivors. They were builders, protectors, and rulers. They appear in burial records, merchant ledgers, and oral traditions passed through firelit halls. And as archaeology advances, we continue to discover graves once misidentified, revised to reflect their true occupants. Warrior women buried with weapons, horses, and honor. Some names are lost to time, but their stories remain etched in stone and saga. And when we speak their names today, we revive their power. These women shaped the Viking world, not from the shadows, but from the front lines. In battle, in leadership, in love, and in legend. They were not exceptions. They were examples, and they deserve to be remembered. Conclusion: reclaiming the forgotten Valkyries. Across the wind-lashed fjords and snow-capped ridges of Scandinavia, a story once buried under centuries of silence is rising again. Not one of kings, conquest, or gods, but of the women who walked among them. The Viking world was more than ships and shields. It was a living, breathing society built on interdependence. And at its heart stood the Viking women. For far too long, their legacy was flattened, dismissed as myth, misinterpreted by patriarchal pens, or forgotten altogether. But as we've traveled through sagas, graves, and genetic truth, we've seen a different image emerge. Not frail nor idle, but fierce. These women carried weapons. They buried their dead with swords and dreams. They sailed into foreign lands not just as loot, but as settlers, leaders, and sometimes as invaders themselves. They weaved sails as wide as kingdoms, crafted iron and poetry with equal skill, commanded farms, forged alliances, shaped laws, raised warriors, and protected bloodlines. Why were they ignored? Because their stories didn't fit the mold. Because strength was written with a beard. Because the Valkyrie became a symbol of fantasy, not history. But now we know better. Consider the bones in Birka, buried with sword and game pieces, once thought male, now DNA confirms, a warrior woman. Think of the sagas, Lager the riding into battle, Queen Asa leading armies, Gudrid crossing oceans. We once called them legends. Now we call them history. And not just warriors, builders, mothers, traders, poets, queens. In a world scarred by war and ice, Viking women were the hearth and the storm. To rediscover them is not just to rewrite footnotes. It is to rewrite the rhythm of history itself. These women didn't demand fame. They demanded survival. They didn't need to be seen. They needed to endure. And they did. In the rough grain of a loom weight, in the worn edge of a sword, in the teeth marks of a comb, in the faded words of runestones and firelit verse. Even their silence speaks. And now, finally, we are listening. What does it mean to reclaim the forgotten Valkyries? It means seeing Viking history as it truly was, shared. It means teaching our daughters that strength wears many faces, that power is not always loud, that history has room for all of us. The Viking Age may be gone. Its longships rot beneath the waves. Its sagas echo faintly in museum halls. But the women remain. In our curiosity, in our courage, in the truth we now choose to tell. And that is the greatest victory of all. Not a raid, not a crown, but remembrance. To the women of the North, we see you now. To the Valkyries of history, your watch has not ended. You ride still, in memory, in myth, and in truth.